today's mindful moment. Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to be looking at how history is manipulated and erased.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating topic.
It is, and we've got a great book to guide us.
Absolutely.
Erasing History by Jason Stanley.
He's great.
Yeah, he gives us a framework for understanding how authoritarian regimes, past and present, really distort and twist the past.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about Stanley, he's not just a scholar. He brings this really unique perspective.
Right.
He's a Yale professor, but he's also the grandson of a Jewish actress who lived through the rise of Nazi Germany.
Wow. So he's seen it firsthand in a way through his family history.
His family history, it's not just an abstract concept for him.
Right. Like he understands the personal cost of this.
Absolutely. And you can feel that in his writing.
Absolutely.
He starts right off by talking about how central this idea of erasing history is to fascism. Because it's all about creating that division between us and them.
Yeah.
And history becomes this weapon to kind of solidify that.
Absolutely. And he talks about his grandmother,
right,
who was a successful actress in Berlin.
Yeah, she was totally integrated, part of German society.
Right. And then the Nazis come to power.
And boom, overnight, she's an outsider.
She's the enemy.
Just because she's Jewish.
Yeah.
It's really chilling how quickly that shift can happen.
And it's not just about individuals. It's about entire groups of people.
Exactly. It's about stripping them of their rights, their belonging, their very history.
And he has this phrase that he uses, semi-citizenship.
Right.
Which I thought was really powerful.
It really captures that precariousness, that constant threat.
Like you're never fully
in. Yeah. You're always on the verge of being outcast.
And he has this really chilling quote. He says, "A fascist form of life requires an education system that can validate the dominant group's elevated status as a justified consequence of history, rather than the fabricated result of intentional choices."
It's powerful because it really gets at that core idea of controlling the narrative.
Yeah.
You control the past, you control the future.
Absolutely. And it's not just some relic of the past.
No.
We see this happening right now.
Oh, absolutely.
In the U.S. in particular.
Yeah.
This surge in right-wing efforts to suppress certain types of education.
Anything that challenges the existing power structures.
Yeah, racial hierarchies, patriarchal norms.
Right, it's all suddenly dangerous indoctrination.
Yeah, like it's a threat.
It's a threat.
Yeah, and we've seen this before.
Oh, yeah.
During the Red Scare.
The Red Scare.
Yeah, fear of communism being used to silence dissent.
Absolutely.
To purge anyone seen as a threat to the status quo.
McCarthyism at its worst.
Right, and it destroyed lives and careers.
It did, yeah.
And it seems like we're kind of
seeing a resurgence.
Yeah, a repeat of that, just with different labels.
Different labels, yeah.
So now it's critical race theory.
Right.
That's the big bogeyman.
The new bogeyman. Yeah.
And there are groups like the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective in Connecticut.
Right.
They're being targeted
for
simply trying to teach about structural racism.
It's really troubling.
It is. And it's not just about silencing academics.
Yeah.
Think about Russia's gay propaganda law.
Right. Any positive or even neutral depiction of LGBTQ relationships is banned.
Like erasing entire communities.
Erasing their experiences, their lives.
And manipulating history.
To fit a very specific ideology.
Yeah, and we see this happening in universities too.
Oh, absolutely.
Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban essentially forced Central European University out of the country.
Right. He labeled it as this breeding ground for anti-Hungarian ideology.
Yeah, so it raises this really crucial question.
Yeah.
Can a university truly be neutral when these kinds of narratives are taking hold?
Or is neutrality itself a form of complicity?
It's a tough question.
It is.
And then we have the case of the Texas Board of Education.
Oh, yeah.
They've been heavily influenced by this conservative group called PragerU.
Right.
And they're literally rewriting history textbooks.
Rewriting history.
To downplay the horrors of slavery.
It's incredible.
Yeah, and you have figures like Candace Owens claiming that because some Africans participated in the slave trade, it somehow lessens the responsibility of white Europeans.
It's a blatant distortion of history.
Yeah, trying to shift blame.
It's really troubling.
It is.
Yeah.
And it ties into this larger tactic that Stanley explores, exploiting nationalism for political gain.
Yeah.
But how do we distinguish between the kind of nationalism that fueled colonialism versus the kind that inspires people to fight for freedom and self-determination?
That's where it gets really tricky.
Yeah.
Because Stanley makes this distinction. between what he calls supremacist nationalism,
Okay.
which is all about domination and hierarchy, versus anti-colonial nationalism, which is rooted in this idea of shared humanity and cooperation.
So supremacist nationalism would be like,
yeah,
we're better than you,
right?
Therefore, we have the right to take what's yours.
Exactly. And it often relies on this myth of empty land. Erasing the presence of indigenous populations to justify colonialism and expansion.
This land was just waiting for us.
Exactly, conveniently ignoring the people who were already there.
Right, and we see that narrative play out.
Over and over.
In so many different contexts.
The Americas, Australia, Israel.
Yeah, all these places with narratives built on this idea.
Of empty land ripe for the taking.
Right, and that erasure has real consequences.
Absolutely.
The destruction of Palestinian educational institutions is a prime example.
It's what some scholars call scholasticide.
Wow.
It's not just about destroying buildings. It's about erasing a people's history, their culture.
Their very presence.
Exactly.
It's a sobering reminder of how much power lies in controlling the narrative of the past.
It really is. But, Stanley doesn't leave us in despair.
Okay.
He also talks about the power of reclaiming history.
Okay.
Of fighting back against these dominant narratives.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting.
It does. There are some really inspiring examples from all over the world.
Like, what are some examples?
Well, think about organizations like Memorial in Russia.
Okay.
They tirelessly documented the crimes of the Stalinist regime.
Wow.
Even when it meant facing persecution and threats.
It's incredible the courage it takes to do that.
It is. It's a testament to the power of truth.
Yeah, and we can't forget the long tradition of Black Americans reclaiming their history.
Absolutely, centuries of scholarship and activism.
Yeah, pushing back against erasure and misrepresentation.
It's an incredible legacy.
It really is.
From James W.C. Pennington's work in the 19th century, challenging the justifications for slavery.
Wow. To W.E.B. Du Bois' groundbreaking book, Black Reconstruction in America.
Right. Black scholars have been fighting to tell their own stories.
To set the record straight.
To reclaim their history.
Exactly.
And that fight continues today.
It does.
With projects like the 1619 Project.
Absolutely.
It aims to reframe American history.
By placing slavery and its legacy front and center.
Right. It's about acknowledging the truth.
Even when it's uncomfortable.
Even when it's difficult.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that history is not static.
Right.
It's constantly being contested, rewritten, and reclaimed.
And that's where we as individuals come in.
That's a great segue into the next part of our deep dive.
Right.
This debate around classical education.
Yeah.
Is it inherently problematic, as some argue?
Yeah.
Or can it be a tool for liberation?
Big questions.
Big questions.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and Stanley doesn't give us any easy answers.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you've got these right-wing groups in the U.S.
pushing for this very specific kind of classical education that they say promotes traditional values.
Okay.
And, counters what they call woke ideology.
Right, so it's almost like they're weaponizing the classics.
Exactly.
Using them as a shield against any kind of progressive thought.
And we've seen this historically.
Right.
Fascist regimes have done this.
Yeah.
They used classical education to promote this narrative of their nation's exceptionalism.
Right.
To justify their dominance over others.
Yeah, it's that old civilization versus savagery.
Exactly. That was used to justify colonialism and imperialism.
So it's like, look, we're the heirs to this great tradition, and therefore we have the right to rule.
Right.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Stanley also points out that classical texts can be used to challenge authoritarianism.
Oh, okay.
To make the case for democracy.
Interesting.
And individual rights.
Okay, so it's not the texts themselves that are the problem.
Right.
It's how they're...
It's the interpretation.
Yeah.
It's how they're taught.
Yeah, how they're framed.
Right.
Yeah.
So take Pericles, his famous funeral oration in ancient Athens.
Okay.
It's a celebration of democracy, of valuing merit over birthright. Of being open to the world.
Right.
These are hardly values that fascists would embrace.
Right. It's almost like a blueprint.
It is.
For a free and open society.
Yeah, and Stanley even points out some surprising examples from Plato.
Oh, really?
Ideas that challenge traditional family structures.
Wow.
And conservative views on sexuality.
That's really interesting.
It's a reminder that these texts are complex.
Right.
And they can be interpreted in multiple ways.
So it's not about just blindly accepting what you're told.
No.
It's about engaging with these ideas critically.
Right.
asking tough questions.
Yeah.
Seeing how they connect to the world we live in today.
Absolutely. And it's ironic, isn't it, that some of the loudest critics of modern education are products of elite universities themselves.
Yeah. It's like they want to dismantle the very system that helped them get where they are.
It's a strange contradiction.
It is, but it points to this larger trend that Stanley warns about.
Yeah.
The rise of anti-education.
Anti-education.
It's not just about controlling what's taught. It's about
dismantling education altogether.
Wow.
It seeks to create a populace that's ignorant, apathetic, and easily manipulated.
Like, don't think, just obey.
Exactly. And this kind of thinking is often driven by those in power who benefit from having a population that's easy to control.
And we see this with the attacks on public education in the U.S.
Absolutely.
The defunding of schools and universities.
Right.
The push for privatization.
Exactly. And Stanley argues that these attacks are driven by a combination of ideological and economic motives.
Okay, so on the ideological side, there are people who genuinely believe that public education is flawed.
Yeah, they think it's too bureaucratic, too inefficient, too beholden to special interests.
And so they see privatization as the answer.
Right. They think that the free market will somehow magically produce better education.
Right. But we know that's not always the case.
It often leads to lower quality education, particularly for students from low-income backgrounds.
Right, and then there's the economic motive.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of money to be made in education.
Yeah.
And privatization creates this huge opportunity for profit.
And that profit often comes at the expense of students.
Especially those who are already marginalized and underserved.
So it's this toxic mix of ideology and greed.
Exactly.
That's driving this attack on public education.
It's deeply concerning, but, Stanley doesn't just leave us with a sense of despair.
Okay, good.
He also talks about the importance of reclaiming history.
Right.
Of fighting back against these attempts to erase and distort the past.
Yeah, and that's where we see the power of collective action.
Absolutely. People coming together to demand a more just and accurate representation of history.
Right. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
It's not just about police brutality.
Right.
It's about challenging the dominant narrative about race in America.
A narrative that's been used to justify discrimination and oppression for centuries.
It's about telling the truth about America's past.
Yeah, acknowledging the legacy of slavery and racism, and demanding a more equitable future.
For all Americans.
And it's not just a movement confined to the U.S.
No, think about the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
It's had a global impact in raising awareness about sexual harassment and assault.
It's about challenging the power structures that have allowed these abuses to go unchecked.
Exactly.
For so long.
And both of these movements are deeply rooted in history.
Yeah.
They're building on the work of generations of activists and scholars.
Who have fought for social justice.
Exactly. And Stanley emphasizes that reclaiming history is not just about grand movements.
It's also about individual action.
Okay. So what can we as individuals do to make a difference?
Well, we can start by educating ourselves about history, seeking out diverse perspectives, challenging our own biases and assumptions.
Right.
We can support organizations that are working to preserve and reclaim history.
Yeah, like what are some examples?
Well, organizations like Memorial in Russia, the Zinn Education Project here in the U.S., the Borderland Foundation in Poland.
Right. So many great organizations out there.
Yeah, it's about being active citizens, engaging in our communities, and using our voices to speak out against injustice.
And recognizing that even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can talk to our friends and families about history.
Yeah.
Share what we've learned.
Right.
Encourage others to think critically about the past.
It's about making history a part of our everyday lives.
Exactly.
Not just something we learn about in textbooks.
And it's about recognizing that history is not just about the past.
Yeah.
It's about the present and the future that we are building together.
So we've talked about the dark side of history.
Yeah.
The attempts to erase and distort it for political gain.
Right.
But we've also seen the power of reclaiming history.
Absolutely.
Of fighting back against these narratives and demanding a more just and accurate representation of the past.
It's an ongoing struggle.
It is. And so what are some of the specific ways that this reclaiming of history is happening?
Yeah.
What are some of the tools and strategies that people are using to push back against these attempts at erasure?
It's almost like we're talking about an archaeological dig of sorts.
Yeah.
But instead of unearthing ancient artifacts, we're uncovering these hidden narratives, these stories that have been buried or deliberately silenced.
That's a great analogy.
And just like with archaeology, there are all these different tools and techniques for reclaiming history.
Like, what are some of the most powerful ones?
Well, I think storytelling is huge.
Yeah.
Think about the impact of books like The Diary of Anne Frank or I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings.
Okay.
These personal narratives give a voice to those who had been silenced.
Yeah.
And they force the world to confront the realities of oppression and injustice.
Yeah, it's about humanizing history.
Exactly.
Making it relatable.
Right.
And emotional.
We connect with those individual stories.
Right.
In a way that we might not with just dry facts and figures.
Yeah, absolutely. And storytelling isn't limited to books.
No, not at all.
Right? We have films, documentaries, even oral histories passed down.
Exactly.
Through generations.
All these different ways of reclaiming and preserving the past.
And Stanley also talks about the importance of monuments and memorials.
They're not just physical structures.
Right.
They're symbols.
Yeah.
That represent a shared history, a collective memory.
Right, like think about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C.
It's not a triumphant arch or a statue of a general on horseback.
It's a wall.
It's a stark, reflective wall inscribed with the names of those who died in the war.
Yeah, and it forces us to confront the human cost of conflict.
To remember those who were lost.
Yeah, and we see similar efforts to create memorials that acknowledge these darker chapters of history.
Right.
Like the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama.
Powerfully.
Which honors the victims of lynching.
It's about truth-telling. Acknowledging the painful parts of our past.
Right.
So that we can learn from them.
Yeah.
And move forward.
And it's not just about creating new memorials.
No.
It's also about reconsidering existing ones.
Right. We've seen all these debates about Confederate monuments in the U.S.
Right. That's a prime example of how history is constantly being
contested and reinterpreted.
These monuments were erected during a time when the dominant narrative celebrated the Confederacy.
Right.
But that narrative is being challenged now.
Absolutely. It raises these really important questions about who gets to tell the story.
Yeah, whose voices are amplified.
And whose are silenced.
Right, and it's a reminder that history is not static.
It's a living thing that evolves.
Yeah, as our understanding of the past changes.
Right.
Another powerful tool for reclaiming history is archival research.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, think about those dedicated historians.
Yeah.
Archivists, librarians.
They're digging through all these documents.
Yeah.
Photographs, letters.
Piecing together these fragments of the past.
It's painstaking work.
It is.
But it's crucial for uncovering those hidden narratives.
Yeah, giving voice to those who have been forgotten or marginalized.
And in the digital age, we have even more tools for sharing these discoveries.
Online databases, digital archives,
social media.
All these platforms allow us to
share historical information
in ways that were never before possible.
It's a democratization of knowledge.
Yeah, it's empowering individuals to become their own historians.
To explore the past and draw their own conclusions.
And Stanley also highlights the importance of education.
Of course.
That's where it all starts.
Right. It's about teaching a more accurate and inclusive version of history.
One that challenges the dominant narratives.
Exactly, and gives voice to those who have been silenced.
It's about equipping students. With the critical thinking skills.
They need to question what they're told, to do their own research, and to come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, it's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about understanding the complexities.
Of the past.
Yeah.
And its relevance to the world we live in today.
And it's about fostering empathy.
Absolutely.
Understanding the experiences of those who are different from us.
That's key.
So we'll talk about storytelling.
Yeah.
Memorials.
Archival research.
Education.
Digital platforms.
It's an impressive arsenal of tools for reclaiming history.
But ultimately, it all comes down to individual action.
It does. Each of us has a responsibility to engage with history.
To learn from it.
Yeah.
And to challenge those who would seek to erase it or distort it.
Yeah, for their own gain.
Right.
It's about being informed.
Engaged citizens.
Yeah, recognizing the power of history.
Absolutely.
And using our voices.
To speak out against injustice.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
It has.
into Jason Stanley's Erasing History.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did, from the tactics used to erase history to the tools we can use to reclaim it.
It's been a fascinating exploration of the power of narrative.
Absolutely.
How history can be manipulated.
Yeah.
And how it can be used to both oppress and liberate.
A huge thank you for guiding us through these complex.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
And at times, unsettling ideas.
Yeah.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Remember, knowledge is power. By understanding how history is manipulated, we can empower ourselves to fight back against attempts to erase and distort the past.
Absolutely.
We encourage you to check out Jason Stanley's book.
Yeah, great book.
Erasing History, to delve even deeper into this crucial subject.
It's worth a read.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
Keep questioning.
Keep questioning everything, and never stop exploring the power of history.
There's a link to buy the book in the episode description. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share it with anyone who loves exploring ideas. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic.